Hi, this is Kevin from Passion for the Word. One of the things I've noticed when reading the Bible is that, with very few exceptions, God likes to use men or people to accomplish his goals. The creation, obviously, and the flood, he did that pretty much just on his own, but like with Moses, God could have just parted the Red Sea, but he told Moses to hold out your staff. Or actually, lift thou up thy rod and stretch out thine hand, and the Red Sea parted. And different examples like this throughout the Bible. He told a man to do something or a woman to do something. When they did it, then God responded. Now, with that, there's some guys, and these guys that I mentioned, they're not in the Bible, but I think that their lives, there's a lot that we can learn from them. Most of us that have become Christians have not done it directly. God has put a person in our path that has guided us or directed us into a life of the Christian walk. We haven't gotten there just between us and God. He's used somebody to bring us there. These are some guys that, like I said, their lives are just, well, let's take a look and see. We're going to look at these men. They have very little in common at first glance, but one thing they do have in common, they were all Christians. They all had great faith, and their faith ended up having an impact on the world around them, and many of them still to this day. Sometimes God will use people that make no sense at all to us. The first man we're going to talk about, well, there's a clergyman in England by the name of Francis Dixon. He started hearing stories about this crazy old preacher, street preacher, on George Street in Sydney, Australia. It seems that this man would pop out of a doorway, hand someone a gospel tract, and say, if you were to die in the next 24 hours, do you know where you'd go? Heaven or hell? And that was it. He'd disappear. Well, he had heard this testimony a couple times, and as he traveled around, he started asking people their testimonies. He'd hear this more often. It just started getting his attention, so he would bring this up when he would preach. That, this guy, and more people started coming back to him and telling him. This preacher is in England. Most of he's traveling all over the world, but his main home base is in England, and he keeps hearing these stories about this crazy old street preacher in Sydney, Australia. Many of the people that had encountered this George Street preacher had gone on to have great ministries of their own. Now, the George Street preacher, after that, he was gone. The different stories were, some of these people, they were so shook up by this. Some of these were sailors. Sydney, Australia is a port city. They'd go back to their ship and they'd go to the chaplain and talk to him, and they'd become Christians. Or they'd go to a church and talk to the pastor there. They always went somewhere else, but the start was this crazy old street preacher that did nothing but hand him a tract and say, if you were to die in the next 24 hours, do you know where you would go, heaven or hell? So Reverend Dixon started keeping track and tabulating this and adding up the people that he had talked to and adding up the people who had gone on to have their own ministries and how many people these people had counted as leading to the Lord. He had counted up that over 100,000 people were either directly or indirectly affected by this crazy street preacher's ministry. Several years later, as he's collecting all this, Reverend Dixon finally gets a chance to preach in Sydney. And he knows he's got to find George Street. And more importantly, he's got to find this crazy street preacher. Couldn't find him anywhere. So he started checking with the churches. Finally, one of the churches goes, oh, that's Mr. Jenner. Yeah. We know all about him. Well, can you tell me? Well, no, he doesn't do that anymore. He's too old. His health is too bad. And Reverend Dixon's kind of saddened by that, but he says, but he's still alive? Yeah, he's still alive. Would he let me come visit him? And, oh, Frank would love to have a visitor. So Reverend Dixon arranged to go meet Frank Jenner. When he finally gets a chance to meet him, Reverend Dixon knocks on the door and he finds this frail old man. And before he says anything to him, he asks the old man for his he introduces himself as a pastor from England and all this, and he wanted to talk to him. And he gets Frank's testimony, and Frank tells him that he was a sailor and he led a wild life. And he got saved. And he was so thankful that he got saved that he promised God he would do a simple ministry. 10 people a day, every day, he would hand them a gospel tract and ask them if they were to die within the next 24 hours, if they knew where they'd go, heaven or hell. And he did this just every day. Now, if he was too sick to do it one day, or 2 days, or however many times, he would make it up by doing 15 a day until he got it caught up, so it was 10 people a day. After he gave his testimony to Reverend Dixon started telling him why he was there, about all the people that he had heard in England and is preaching all over the world, people from India. Remember, it's a port city, so people from all over the world are going to be coming and going through here. That was one of the advantages, to really spread it out. He started telling them about the 100,000 souls that were heaven-bound because of his ministry. Frank Jenner just wept. He had been doing this for 40 years. Not once in the entire 40 years had he heard a single life, not one, that had been affected by this. He was just keeping a promise to God. He had faith that God would reward his actions. He just kept doing it with no attaboys, no thank yous. Now, how many of us would do that? Keep doing a ministry for 40 years without once hearing that you're doing a great job. Look at all the people you're touching. He never got a thank you. His name wasn't on book covers. You didn't see him at the, you didn't see, he was a nobody. He was literally on earth just another guy. But in heaven, I'll bet it's a different story up there. It's when you make your focus on serving God and not serving man, it's amazing what you can accomplish for the kingdom. I think it's safe to say that when Frank Jenner arrived in heaven, he heard, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." And that should be the ultimate goal of every Christian. A verse that I think brings this up very well is Matthew 6, 1 through 4, right out of the Sermon on the Mount. "Take heed that you do not your alms," basically your charitable deeds, "do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise ye have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Therefore, when thou doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogue and in the streets, that they may have the glory of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But when thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth, that thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret himself shall reward thee openly." Basically, if you seek your rewards on earth, if you need to be recognized here for your deeds, then here is where your reward will be. Frank Jenner did not need rewards here. He was looking to get his rewards in heaven, where moth and rust cannot corrupt. In 1855, there was a boys' Sunday school teacher in Detroit by the name of Edward Kimball. Now, Mr. Kimball was not your typical Sunday school teacher. He had a real heart to bring his boys to salvation. One of his students, a young man by the name of Dwight, had good attendance but not much else. Dwight barely seemed able to pay attention in class, sometimes even falling asleep. Mr. Kimball decided he had to up his game. Now, Dwight was an apprentice at Holton's shoe store, and Mr. Kimball decided to pay Dwight a visit at work. He found Dwight at the back of the store, wrapping shoes and putting them in paper and putting them in boxes, and then placing them on the shelf. Mr. Kimball later said, "I went up to him, and I put my hand on his shoulder, and as I leaned over, I placed my foot upon a shoebox. Then I made my plea, and I feel that it was really a very weak one. I don't know just what words I used, nor could he tell. I simply told him of Christ's love for him and the love Christ wanted in return." Remember the name Edward Kimball. We'll be coming back to him. But first, we're going to take a look at the life of a man by the name of Matthew Fontaine Maury, the man called the Pathfinder of the Seas. Mr. Maury was a Christian, a scientist and a creationist. Don't let anybody tell you that a Christian can't be a scientist or a creationist can't be a scientist. They make the best ones. They're honest. He was born in Virginia in 1806. Throughout his young life, he was surrounded by strong Bible-believing Christians. He had a natural love of the ocean and ocean travel, and worked his way up to becoming second in command of a ship. Then in 1839, while on leave, he was in a stagecoach or a buggy accident, and it broke his femur, and he was essentially crippled for life. About this time, being bedridden, he was reading his Bible, and he came across Psalm 8:8. Psalm 8:8 is, "The fowl of the air and the fish of the sea, and whatsoever passeth through the paths of the seas." Mr. Mowry believed the Bible. So if it said paths of the seas, there must be paths of the seas. At this point in his life, he started collecting ship's captain's logs and studying them intently. In 1855, he wrote the book, The Physical Geography of the Sea, which was the first major publication on ocean and wind currents. He discovered ocean and wind currents. He would look at the ship's captains and the ship's captain's logs, and note that, especially at the time of the sailing ships, the shortest way across the ocean was not necessarily the fastest, and fuel wasn't an issue. I mean, sailboat fuel's free, but food was precious. They could only store so much food to get across the ocean. So time was important, not distance. Through his discoveries, because he believed Psalm 8:8, and his studying the ship's captain's logs, he was able to cut the trip across the ocean by roughly a third. He's considered today the father of oceanography, and the father of, and I can't remember what the term is, but for wind currents. He discovered these because of his belief in the Bible. The next man we're going to examine has inspired me with his focus on the kingdom and not the world, a man by the name of Horatio Gates Spafford. Mr. Spafford was a prominent Chicago lawyer and a Christian at the same time. I know, mind-blowing, and that's not even the inspiring part. He lost his only son to scarlet fever when the boy was only 4. He, Horatio, and his wife Anna had vast real estate holdings in Chicago. Unfortunately, they lost everything in the famous Chicago fire of 1871. Mr. Spafford and his wife were big supporters of D.L. Moody, who was considered the greatest evangelist of his day, and they decided they would take a ship to England where Moody was preaching. This was going to be a much-needed family vacation for Mr. Spafford, his wife, and their 4 daughters. Annie, age 11, Maggie, 9, Bessie, 5, and 2-year-old Tanetta. At the last minute, Mr. Spafford was delayed due to business, and he had to send his family on ahead, and he told them, I'll see you soon. I'll be on the, one of the next ships to come across as soon as I get this done. But early in the morning, on November 22nd, 1873, while crossing the Atlantic on the steamship Ville de Havre, their ship was struck by another ship. The Ville de Havre sank in 12 minutes. 226 lives were lost, including all 4 of the Spafford's daughters. Anna's last memory before passing out was having the waves taking 2-year-old Tanetta from her grip. Anna was later found floating on a piece of debris. When she arrived in England, she sent a 2-word telegram back to him: survived, alone. Mr. Spafford took the next ship to England, and he asked the captain to let him know when they arrived at the spot of the accident. The captain let him know. When he got there, Horatio took out pen and paper and wrote, "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." That's right. Amidst all the tragedy in this life, in this world, Horatio Gates Spafford penned what is truly one of the greatest hymns of all times. If that's not living a life focused on the kingdom, then I don't know what is. The number of lives that have been affected and strengthened by that song, and he got it at that moment in his life. I just find that amazing. But you heard me mention that the Spaffords were big supporters of D.L. Moody. So let's look at a little bit about, see who this D.L. Moody is. D.L. Moody was considered the greatest evangelist of his time, which would be in the late 1800s. It is said that over the course of his lifetime, he shared the gospel with 100 million people. And this was before technology made that an easy thing to do. He was preaching 6 sermons a day, a month before he died. He traveled the States and abroad delivering his message. Some of his great quotes are, "Where one man reads the Bible, 100 read you and I." Or, "A man ought to live so that everybody knows he is a Christian, and most of all, his family ought to know." And my favorite of his, "The Bible will keep you from sin, or sin will keep you from the Bible." In 1886, Moody started what would later be called the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, Illinois. The Moody Bible Institute today has around 3,500 graduates per year that go out teaching about Jesus and leading people to salvation. One day at a get-together, Moody sat down next to a gentleman by the name of Wilbur Chapman. Chapman told Moody that he wasn't sure if he was saved. Moody handed him an open Bible and pointed to John 5:24. "Verily, verily." Now when Jesus wants to get our attention, he says verily. When he really wants to get our attention, he says verily, verily. It means surely or truly. So, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that heareth my word and believeth on him that sent me hath everlasting life, and shall not come into condemnation, but is passed from life unto death." Moody then asked, "Do you believe this?" Chapman responded, "Certainly." Moody asked, "So are you a Christian?" To which Chapman said, "Sometimes I think I am, but sometimes I'm fearful." Moody said, "Read it again." Moody kept saying that. Chapman kept repeating his answer. Moody then asked, "Who are you doubting? Now read it again." Chapman said from that day forth, he never questioned his salvation. Chapman ended up preaching with Moody all over the world before branching out on his own. Sometime later, Chapman hired a young man named Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday became one of the greatest preachers of his day, the early 1900s, preaching to millions. His style was unorthodox for his day. His language was a little coarse, but it spoke to the common man. With phrases like, "I'm against sin. I'll kick it as long as I have a foot. I'll fight it as long as I have a fist. I'll butt it as long as I have a head. I'll bite it as long as I have a tooth. And when I'm old and fistless and footless and toothless, I'll gum it until I go home to glory and home to perdition." And it goes home to perdition. When questioned about the usefulness of revival, Sunday said, "They tell me revival is only temporary, but so is a bath. But it does a lot of good." And my personal favorite of his, "Hell is the highest reward that the devil can offer you for being a servant of his." Chew on that one a bit. At one of Sunday's revivals, a man with a name I find somewhat ironic, Mordecai Ham, came to know the Lord. Now first you have this incredibly Jewish first name, Mordecai, and then this incredibly non-kosher last name, Ham. That's Mordecai Ham. I think that's funny. Anyway, Mordecai Ham got saved, got led to the Lord at one of Billy Sunday's revivals. Mordecai eventually became a good old-fashioned Southern preacher. One day, while preaching in Charlotte, North Carolina, Ham had announced that he knew there was a house of ill repute across the street from the local school, and the male students would get out on their lunch break and they would skip school and skip lunch and go to the house of ill repute. Some of the students decided they were going to go there because they weren't real happy about breaking up their good thing. And they were going to try to disrupt this revival. Well, one of the kids that went there was this lanky young man known as Billy Frank by his family. and he went to see what would happen. Billy was intrigued by what he heard and saw that night and went back the next night. Well, eventually he responded to Ham's altar call and gave his life to Christ right there. Billy Frank, better known to you and I as Billy Graham, went on to become the evangelist that has preached to more people than any man in history, more than the Apostle Paul. You may wonder why I gave this little history lesson. Well, let's go back to D.L. Moody and see where this all started. When Moody was asked about his conversion to Christ, he said that when he was a young man, he attended Sunday school. He wasn't the best student, oftentimes falling asleep in class. But his Sunday school teacher wasn't willing to let any of his boys slip through the cracks, and came to where Moody worked as an apprentice shoe salesman. His teacher walked up to him, put his hand on Moody's shoulder, put his foot up on the shoebox, and then with tears in his eyes, told him about Christ's love for him. You may have guessed by now that Dwight L. Moody's Sunday school teacher was none other than Mr. Edward Kimball, a man so little known that he doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. But look at the millions upon millions of lives that have been touched by his obedience to the Word and his faith. Imagine if Mr. Kimball had simply given up on a young and somewhat rebellious Dwight Moody. There are numerous lessons we can learn by any of these guys, from Frank Jenner, perseverance, and the fact that we don't need to be lining up our rewards here on earth. This isn't the Bible never says to focus on rewards here. It's all about what we get there. This is meaningless here as far as rewards. We could look at Edward Kimball. His ministry may have seemed so small. He was just a Sunday school teacher. He didn't know at the time that he was actually the first step on a long list of some of the greatest preachers of the last 150 years. He had no way to see that he was the beginning of this. His ministry seems small. If you think your ministry is small and unimportant, don't even go there. You have no idea what God's goal is for your ministry. You may be leading the next Dwight Moody into a great life of service. Each of these men, there's so many things that we can learn just by examining their lives, their strong faith, their unshakable faith. But that's it for this video. Of course, I thank you all for watching. Please hit please share these videos. Hit the subscribe if you haven't done so. Hit the notification bell so you'll be notified when we do a new video. Please tell your friends about this, and most of all, keep praying for us. Thank you, and God bless.